Okay, good morning, good afternoon. This is going to be a 1-hour webinar. My name's Dom Phillips. I'm a British journalist based here in Rio de Janeiro. I write a lot for The Guardian and some others as well. Like I say, this is going to be a 1-hour webinar. We're going to start by discussing Amazon Undercover, a documentary recently released in Brazil and now traveling around the world. It's a very good film, an essential viewing for anyone who wants to understand Amazon issues in a little more depth. And we're then going to learn a little bit more about the current situation in Brazil and find out more about how the government, companies, organizations, and even individuals in the UK can help to combat the destruction of the Amazon and the threats to its people. I'd like to start by introducing the people that I'm very happy to have here on the panel. Estevão Chiavata is a Brazilian filmmaker and the director of Amazon Undercover. He's here with us today, and he's going to share some of his experience with the film production. He has a lot of experience filming in the Amazon. He's done a lot of work up there, and he knows a lot about the place. Together with Estevão, we are also very pleased to have with us here today Fiona Watson, who is the Director of Research and Advocacy at Survival International. She has also worked for many, many, many years in the Amazon with indigenous people. And I've been to indigenous reserves in the Amazon, and they were talking very highly of Fiona when I got there. Joe Blackman, the Head of Forests Policy and Advocacy at Global Witness. Nikki Mardas, the Executive Director of Global Canopy. Tika Minami, the Director of Campaigns at Greenpeace Brazil. So, very good climate, a very good panel here. This is a London Climate Action Week webinar, and our special thanks to the organizers of the event. Before we kick off, we're going to watch the trailer of Amazon Undercover so that anyone who has not seen it can get a flavor. Afina, could you play it for us now, please?
Fala, gente boa. Alô? Qual que é o tamanho daquela fazenda ali de céu azul ali? 760 aqui. Qual que é o valor dela? 20 milhões. Tá joia. Eu tô mexendo no negócio aqui.
Nós temos uma área mais ou menos equivalente a 2 vezes o estado de Minas Gerais, na Amazônia, disponíveis para grilagem, que era a apropriação de grandes extensões de floresta para revender essas áreas no futuro. É uma forma de crime, de fato, organizado.
Quem é o maior vendedor de fazenda hoje do Parazão? É você, cara. O cara tem que bajular você.
Então, a especulação fundiária é o primeiro motivo que move essa questão do desmatamento aqui.
Pagava quanto aqui?
Você pagava 3 mil pra mim que corto e... Quanto você? 1.600.
Só tem essa ilha aqui, já de floresta. Por trás, os madeireiros já vêm fazendo essa destruição.
Difícil combater num ambiente que você não tem um lado legal para você apoiar.
De fato, a sociedade vive o crime ambiental.
Isso aqui tudo é cambaral. Essa aqui é a maçaranduba. E essa aqui é o IP.
É a nossa floresta que nós estamos cuidando. A gente vai cuidar da floresta.
Lá é a última fronteira agrícola do Brasil. Então, volta lá hoje, deixa você pegar um mato, um pedaço de terra, você fica rico de novo.
Okay, that was a clip from the film Amazon Undercover. I'd like to ask the filmmaker, Estevão, what have you learned about the forest and its people that you didn't know before the production of this film? And what can you tell us about land grabbing? And you have about 3 minutes if you're able to stay within that.
Okay, well, hello, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all. Well, I think that the most important thing about the film, there are 2 important things on different sides of the issue. One is the union of the indigenous people and riverside people That's something really new and something unprecedented in the history of Amazon, because until a few years ago or some decades ago, they were kind of enemies. No? The people that now lives in the riverside, they were the invading the indigenous areas, but now they have an enemy in common, and a great part of this enemy are the land grabbers. And it's important to say that uh, when I started this film 5 years ago, I noticed that the issue of land grabbing in Amazon and the amount of unprotected forest in Amazon, that was a huge and very important issue. But it was something that was happening undercover. I mean, for the land grabbers, it's important that no one speaks and say about this. And I think that one of the great goals of the film during this year, during 2020, was to definitely put the land grabbing on the Amazon discussion, not only about illegal logging or meat or soy, but also these criminals that are on the beginning of the process of transforming the forest into plantations, or even into nothing. Because when you see what happened to the clear areas that were forests, if you take 10 hectares, the only three of them are on the medium of the productivity of Brazilian land. Six are under, and three there are nothing. So it's a very bad business for the world, but for these people, for these mafias, and it's a good deal, but only for them. For us all, it's hell. So I think that the film is about the conflict of these two visions of the world and of the forest. And for sure I learned a lot, and about the indigenous cultures, about the Munduruku people and the struggle to defend their forest. And spiritually for me also was a very strong experience. So I think just to begin is to put that the film was born into this idea of collisions, of visions of the world.
Okay, very interesting and worth noting. I think that the Brazilian government has a bill in Congress to which effectively legalizes land grabbing up to a certain point. It was a presidential decree at the end of last year that expired, and it's now in Congress again. And it's one of the arguments that the Vice President of Brazil, General Hamilton Mourão, uses as an argument to saying that the Brazilian government needs to approve this law in order to be able to control deforestation, which is not the case, because in most cases, the government already knows who's responsible for deforestation. Most of it happens in land that's already registered to somebody. I'd like to ask Fiona, Joe, and Nikki in this order, what were your main takeaways from the film? And if you can keep your answers to about 2 minutes, that would be great. Starting with you, please, Fiona.
Okay, yeah, well, hello everybody, and thanks very much, Esteban, for your very powerful film, which I thought was a great sort of overview of what is happening in the Amazon and conveys the urgency of the situation. What I took away from it, I think one of the main points was the resilience and organization of the indigenous peoples in the Amazon. So where you see the Munduruku, as Esteban said, forming an unprecedented alliance with a neighboring riverine community. For me, they come over as real protagonists defending the forest. And I think this feeds into a wider issue and an extremely important point as we're discussing all these major planetary challenges like global warming, climate change. The indigenous peoples are absolutely fundamental in this. Their knowledge, their deep connection with the forest, they are scientists, they're zoologists, they're botanists, they're a whole load of things. But these people are absolutely on the front line now with very little, or sometimes in many cases, no support for various reasons from the federal agencies. So we're also talking about people who are laying down their lives. The violence in the Amazon, particularly against Indigenous and other forest rights defenders, is growing all the time. And I think that came through really well. And they didn't come through as victims, they came through as strong people. And that was great. So that made me feel positive and optimistic that these people are there, thank goodness. I think on the other side of the coin, I think the film conveys the sheer scale of what is happening, the massive scale of the illegal land grabbing, and that's just the illegal land grabbing, let alone all the other, stuff, the logging, the mining, etc. And the difficulty, those in the federal agencies who are trying to do something are fighting with their hands tied against their backs, because the government, the current government, is weakening legislation, slashing the budgets of the Indigenous Affairs and Environmental Agency, whose constitutional obligation is to protect the forests and Indigenous people's lands. And for me, one thing that really came out, and it came out through the phone taps, which I thought were very visceral and a very sort of strong reminder, it is not just of the sheer criminality, as Esteban said, but these huge amounts of money involved. And so I think the scale is massive. And I think, what the Indigenous movement are now calling legislated genocide, the complicity of government, some sectors of government and politicians, and not least the current president in all of this.
Okay, great. Joe, what was your takeaway from the film?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Dom. I thought it was a really powerful film, and all credit to all those involved in the production. I mean, as Fiona said, it really brought home very starkly the crucial role played by Indigenous groups, Indigenous people, which we know from our own work as well, are really on the front line of defending some of these really climate critical rainforests and ecosystems that are so crucial for the rest of the world as well. I thought it was really interesting as well in terms of the threats and the pressures on the forests from land grabbing, at the start, but then we saw that's also tied up in illegal logging, which then in turn is about, also conversion of the forest for pasture for cattle and production of soy. So, these are commodities that we know are also driven by global trade and global demand and connected to the rest of the world. They're not just about, some do stay in Brazil as well, but there are these huge global links as well, which raise questions for all of us about what our companies, investments and governments can be better doing to tackle that. And I, also felt like Fiona said, the kind of scale is staggering, and the kind of capacity that you need for enforcement bodies to have to support Indigenous groups to kind of keep these illegal activities out of the forest is really huge. And we know all too well that Bolsonaro has been cutting budgets, undermining these bodies, and just a sense of the challenge really, becoming bigger as also these pressures on the forest and people involved in the legal activities are feeling emboldened as well under Bolsonaro's regime. And I think the threats we've seen obviously take a particular form in Brazil, particularly under Bolsonaro, but what I want to add is, in terms of global perspective, they're not unique. We do see this replicated across other rainforests that we look at in our work, including in Papua New Guinea and Congo Basin as well. And I think the point I'd bring it back to is for me, they also kind of really highlight the responsibility on all of us to ensure that our consumption, supply chains, investments aren't fueling this global deforestation, and that our governments are doing all they can as well to ensure they're not complicit in the escalation of threats and pressures on the rainforest that are illustrated so well in the film.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Nikki, what did you think? And just a reminder of all of you, please do try and keep within 2 minutes. I know it's not easy to do that, but if you can just try and keep a rough eye on how long you're talking for. Nikki, what was your takeaway?
Thank you very much, Dom, and thank you, Esteva. It was a fantastic film. I mean, the main takeaway is watch it, share it, and then go back and watch it again. I mean, we need to get this out there. So if you haven't watched it yet, definitely watch it. That's my main takeaway. It's a wonderful film telling a powerful story, but it's also our story, and it's a violent story, as has already been said, of how forests turn into fire, turn into farms, turn into food on our plates. And that's not one that's well understood. And this film really lays it out in the role of undercover criminal networks, as Estevão has said. And we're living in a bubble, disconnected from the origins of what we consume. And this film helps to reconnect us with these issues that we are intimately connected to through our economies. I was very struck also from having been in the region that it starts with the road, the BR-163, you know, this going 1,000 kilometers into the forest. And, you know, in the early 1970s, it starts with one road. It starts with one, we know what the road was. And, you know, the film says at the beginning, we've lost 20% of the Amazon since 1970, but now 20% more is at threat because one road has become, as others have said, has become a vast network of infrastructure and finance. And there are 1 million roads now, not, you know, roads in many terms, capital flows, commodities going out, 30 to 50 billion a year we hear in infrastructure every year. And we're reaching a tipping point. That 20% goes, we're reaching a tipping point. I mean, I too felt that the communities are clear protagonists in such a wonderful and inspiring way. And up against this industrialized machine underpinned by these criminal networks, the community makes their own road. They come a road of their own kind, and they go and demarcate, and we follow their journey demarcating their land and drawing their own boundary around their land. So just to finish, I mean, the music's fantastic. It's a fantastic experience. And the film starts and ends with this very powerful, beautiful, lyrical song, which is very nicely translated. My Portuguese isn't quite good enough to get the nuance, but in English, in the translation, it says, "Don't mess with me, I'm not alone." And, you know, I think that's the message of the film. And we're all part of the machine, and we're part of the machine, we'll all be ruined by it. So we better join that community that we saw so powerfully in the film, and all do something about it, supporting these communities.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. And it's interesting you mentioned the roads, because that is a priority of the Bolsonaro government, is to build more roads throughout the Amazon. They finished asphalting the BR-163, the road that's in the film, sort of around November last year. I was in the region at the time, and they were working overnight with the army asphalting this road. And it's a project that they have allied with the Brazilian military to build and finish as many roads as they can in the Amazon. I'd like to turn to Tika now and ask, could you update us from your point of view on the latest regarding the situation in Brazil, particularly Amazon deforestation and the setbacks for the rights of indigenous people? And if you can keep that to 2 minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Don, and also Estevão for the film. Very timing, actually. I think that, well, as all have been following, well, the situation in the Amazon has been dramatic. It is also true that there's forces of destruction, or the way that we intensively use the natural resources from the Amazon and the wealth from the Amazon, economically and politically, have been there for decades now. We have seen, like, in the past 40 years, we have destroyed almost 20% of the Amazon. We are reaching the tipping point. However, under this regime we have now in Brazil, the scale, the speed, and the scale and the speed of the threats are unprecedented. So we are reaching a tipping point, and the current government wants actually to speed up the same model of development that is using intensively the resources, destroying the forest, aggravating climate change, and also threatening and undermining the indigenous people rights. What we are seeing is actually the opposite that the government should be doing. the government and also companies should be standing up and actually taking bold action to protect the forest in Brazil and in other parts of the world. There are already a lot of studies and polls showing that the indigenous people are the best guardians of the forest, actually because, and the forests where there are people living, not only the indigenous people, but also the Ribeirinhos and the riverine people, are the most preserved ones, are most resilient to climate change, because there are people there taking care of those forests. So, but what we are seeing now, which is dramatic, is actually that the Bolsonaro regime, instead of protecting the forest and doing what the government should be doing, is actually taking the opposite direction and is speeding the scale and intensity and speed of that destruction. And actually what is even more sad is that the government is taking not only the forest, the environment as a whole, or the indigenous people, and also civil society like the NGOs and the work of NGOs as enemies, and declaring a war. However, this is not a war where one side is going to win and the other is going to lose. Actually, we are, if the indigenous people fall, we will all fall. If the Amazon fall, there is no future. So either we're all gonna win or we all gonna lose.
Okay, that's interesting. I think it's worth something I would like to ask yourself and Stefan first, if Stefan could answer first, and then yourself, Tika. And this is an argument the Bolsonaro government makes quite strongly. How do you convince Amazon residents that conserving the forest is a good idea, when many of them, and there are 24 million people living in the Amazon, and most of them are not on Amazon reserves, many of them do not believe that global warming exists or that it has a human cause. They don't accept these arguments in many, many cases. Stefan, how do you convince them that they do need to protect the forest when it's also one of the poorest regions of Brazil? I believe it's the second poorest region of Brazil in terms of education and sanitation, these kind of things.
Well, we have to take a look about the history of the Amazon region and understand that the result of the last 50 years and what it is the lowest index of social index in Brazil, contributing to a small amount of our how to say PIB, gross Produto Interno Bruto.
GDP, gross domestic product.
GDP, and with a place with a very low productivity in terms of agriculture and in terms of richness to these people. So when we watch this, we see that what was the pattern of development. This word is a very tricky, but the pattern of this development was in a bad way, because the results are already there. But the most important thing is that when you talk to the people in the region, this argument that they have to deforest or they have to mine to feed their children or to feed themselves, it shows the lack of planning to the region, because we already have projects, we already have examples, not only projects, but examples, concrete examples of cities, of reserves that are producing richness for the people with a very good quality for these people, but they are working in specific areas and not as a public policy. So what's going on is that the politics are driven by the ones who cut the forest. So for them, it's interesting to keep this going on and to claim that they have to do that in order to survive. So it's a kind of using of this situation, just like we have here in the favelas of Brazil, and we don't give education, good education. We don't give a good quality of social infrastructure, and we can dominate these people. So it's something that we have to change from showing a different perspective. And in my case, that work with media, is to show that we already have places with which shows a way to get out of this. Just like we could say in Paragominas, where it was in the 90s, Paragobala, the place of most violent and more deforestation in Brazil, that now works with in the Green Municipalities program in the government of Pará, and putting together familiar agriculture with merenda escolar, how to say that, food for the schools,
school dinners, school meals, yeah.
So we already have things going on.
Okay, and it's a good example. It's a good example. It's interesting in your film that you do show two loggers who have been logging illegally and have been stopped, and they say on camera that they don't have any other way to make a living. What's your take on this, Tika? What do you think?
Well, what I've been seeing is that actually, in the last couple of years, we have been navigating a very polarized society, very divided, which also makes things very difficult. There's all this post-truth era where people also don't know what to believe, who to believe, what is right or what is wrong. Actually, I also have been seeing on a lot of polls and data, and actually Brazilians do believe on climate change because they are facing the consequences or the impacts in their daily lives. Floods, droughts, loss of, landsliding and heat waves. So they feel that it's already happening. And also we have, I saw a poll yesterday from 9 countries saying that Brazilians are leading in the poll, saying that they see catastrophic risks from climate change. On the other hand, we ourselves have commissioned a poll to know what Brazilians think about the Amazon and the protection of the Amazon. And it was really good to see that actually the vast majority of Brazilians want the Amazon protected. And the vast majority of Brazilians actually responded that even that they prefer to have the Amazon protected than cut down for economic reasons or even to grow the country economically. What we need to understand is that the environmental issue or the Amazon issue is not disconnected from economics or politics. I know it's kind of boring issues, but actually this is what is driving the deforestation and the violations of indigenous people rights. So I think, and also it's not, it would be unfair, actually, as the example you quoted, to say that the people that are put there to cut the trees, actually they have no alternative. So I think that Brazil is a blessed country. We have the Amazon, we have all these natural resources, but actually what we would need is to have more investment in science, more investment in education and technology, so we could have an economy that is centered and value the biodiversity, that put nature first. So also we have to challenge this current frame dictated by the government, saying that either you have jobs or you have rights, either you have development or you protect the forest. No. This is a false dilemma. We don't have to choose between them because we need both. There is no development without nature. So I think that we need to start to see that is actually the natural resources that put Brazil in a very good place to be, you know, a powerful nation, but it cannot be, the economy cannot be based on the land grabbing or land possession and the land use. It has to be centered in other values, in the standing forest, in the knowledge of traditional people, and the biodiversity. These are the imperatives today if we want to fight climate change, but also the loss of biodiversity.
I think it's a very good point about the poll, and it was very interesting to see that result. However, my experience traveling around Brazil is that there is a lot of ignorance about what climate change is, what global warming is, and people can be very responsive to a lot of the fake news, as you rightly point out, in a very polarized environment that is put out by the government and its supporters. It does have an impact. When Bolsonaro says Brazilians don't want foreigners telling us what to do about our forest, that resounds, and it's understandable as well when Brazilians say, well, you cut down all your forests, why should we protect ours? I think it's a very good point that, you know, how do you get that message across? It's a dilemma. I don't have any answers, but I'd like to move on now to Fiona with another question. If we can move on, can you tell us about the demands that Brazilian indigenous leaders Davi Kopanauer and Raioni presented to the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson earlier this year? And what has happened since then? You've got 3 minutes if you could keep it to that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, a delegation of Yanomami and Kayapo indigenous people were in the UK in February and handed in a letter to Boris Johnson. They didn't have a meeting with him. And to my knowledge, to date, they've had no reply to that letter, which I think speaks volumes about the UK's lack of engagement with indigenous peoples, particularly considering Davi and Raoni are two of the most prominent indigenous leaders and spokespeople in Brazil. In the letter, they made it very clear their anger about what was happening in Brazil with the current government and Bolsonaro's extremely racist remarks, which are fueling the invasion of their land, the attacks on their people. And one of the biggest demands was, obviously they said that the UK, and indeed all governments, but the UK, have to ensure that anything that's imported into their countries does not come from indigenous territories. That's, you know, timber, gems, minerals, etc. And they particularly highlighted their huge opposition, which reflects the indigenous movement in general. I mean, I think it's pretty uniform. There are very few indigenous people I've met, certainly, who are pro-mining. Mining is so destructive, whether it's corporate mining, which has not happened yet on indigenous territories, but looks like it could, and the very destructive placer mining with all the garimpeiros, these thousands and thousands of illegal gold miners contaminating rivers with their dredges, with the mercury that they use to separate the gold. London, they say in the letter, London is the head of the international mining industry. Many international mining companies have their headquarters in London and are listed on the London Stock Exchange. The UK itself imports a lot of gold from Brazil. So this was a very key demand about the role that the UK government has in legislating and ensuring that these companies are upholding not just laws in Brazil, but international law. And that moves on to the next key demand, which was for the UK to ratify the only international convention on Indigenous and tribal people's rights, which is known as International Labour Organization Convention 169. And that's very important because the UK government has argued in meetings over years with Survival that the UK has no Indigenous people, so therefore why should it sign? And that isn't an argument. And I think increasingly, because of the UK involvement, whether the UK is funding projects, whether UK-based companies are operating on Indigenous lands or having an impact on Indigenous lands, they are duty bound to uphold the highest standards, which in this case, legal standards, which can be enforced, is the ILO 169, which Brazil has also ratified. And indeed, there are 3 European countries which do not have indigenous peoples, which have already ratified 169. So that was an important demand. The other demand was the very key issue for all indigenous peoples around the world, that any developments or projects, anything that's going to impact them or anything that people want to carry out on their land has to be done with their free, prior and informed consent. And this is increasingly not only key, but I think, lots of businesses and companies are accepting that this is the only way, it's the only legal, moral and ethical way to behave and get indigenous people's consent. It's not enough to consult. They have to have the power of veto, because these lands are their lives and their livelihoods. Who wants to see people coming in, trashing their back garden? None of us want this, nor the indigenous people. And I think this is something that governments really and companies really, really have to take on board, this very crucial issue. The last point that they made, again, a very important point, is the UK government is hosting the UN Climate Change Conference next November, which will be held in Scotland. And I think, as everybody, all the other panelists have said, and as the film shows, indigenous peoples are absolutely central to the future of our planet, not just for the future of Amazonia or indeed for themselves. And this is something they often say, is that we are holding up the forest. We are protecting the forest and biodiversity, not just for ourselves, but for all of humanity. So the letter said to the UK government, we want a place at the table. We want to be considered as equals. We are not add-ons to be involved in peripheral side conferences, meetings at conferences, which you see so often in international fora. We are central, make us central, consult us, listen to us, work with us as equals.
Okay, Afina, we have a video message from David Kopanauer we'd like to show here. Are you able to run that video for us, please? Very powerful video, and I think that gets the importance of this over, having seen personally close up some of the destruction that mining brings to that reserve, the Yanomami Reserve. It really is an urgent situation, very related to the spread of COVID in the reserve. Okay, I'd like to move on now. Nikki, I'd like to ask you, what does Global Canopies data tell us about the UK consumption of commodities from the Amazon that present a risk to the forest? And if you can keep it to 3 minutes, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Dom. And I can't resist to say that I mean, the film was brilliant, and Esteban's film is worth watching just for a discourse about dinosaurs and who's a dinosaur, and kind of gets to the point that it's this culture, it's our culture that is going to turn out to be the dinosaurs, and indigenous cultures that are resilient, as truly resilient, as has been said before. So on your question, it's worth pointing out that transparency is a major problem and a major issue, and that's part of the gift of this film, is a part of a move to get more transparency and get more accountability. So we've been, all these flows of commodities, including the mining commodities, but also big agribusiness that drive deforestation, have been very opaque and complex. 10 years ago, we went out to big companies and asked them to declare, to report on their impact on forests through their supply chains, and they really couldn't. I mean, we were at a time when there was very little data. Companies didn't really understand these issues at all, except for very, very few leaders. And some of those companies, thank goodness now, are the leaders. They're doing the best. UK companies are doing relatively well. 80% that we track have policies on deforestation, but that's a drop in the ocean. There's so much more to do, and a much smaller number actually report on their progress. We still don't have transparency on their implementation of what they're saying they're going to do. So we've got a long way to go until we have the transparency that we need to get real accountability. We have to keep going with that. In terms of the commodities themselves, beef cattle is the biggest driver in the Amazon, and a great deal is exported, including to the UK. And soy is now secondary. There's been an effective moratorium, some here worked on. But it's worth just pointing out that soy is now moving on to pasture. So it's all part of an interconnected system. And actually the overall amount of pasture, although growth for cattle is driving deforestation, there isn't actually a growing amount of pasture overall in the Amazon because soy is going on to the pasture. So it's all part of an interconnected system that we saw in the film. You really can't say it's now all cattle, not soy. That's not right. It's both that are still part of the system. And the UK has a relatively small direct share of these commodities. A lot still comes in, but compared to some other countries. But the point is, this is an interconnected global system. So we're getting imports in from the Netherlands of commodities that are coming from the Amazon. We're then feeding soy to cattle that are being exported out to other countries. So it's a very complex system. Deforestation's in our food, soy mainly fed to livestock. It's in, to give you another example, it's in leather in car seats. We might be importing cars from Germany, big German companies that are making seats that are using leather that has a very high risk of coming from the Amazon. So really it's everywhere. And all of this is driving the market, and at the root of the land grabbing, which is what we see in the film. We're all connected to that. And where we source from is so important. It's not just a question of volume. And some of the work that Global Canopy has done with the Stockholm Environment Institute on a project called Trace, that is available online and free for everyone to access, tries to map in its entirety these supply chains and see where in Brazil, where in the Amazon soy and beef are coming from that are being used here. And the where is very important, because if what you're sourcing comes from high risk areas, and indeed areas with violence towards communities, and that's what we need to home in on and understand, not just the volumes, which nevertheless are very high. And a final point is just to talk a little bit about the UK as a financial center. We've already talked about money. Fiona's talked about the UK being a center for mining companies, and UK investors, UK banks are funding deforestation. Trace also has a finance tracking tool, Trace Finance, that looks at over $1 trillion annually in investment and lending linked to deforestation, not just in Brazil, all over the world. So we really need to look at our financial flows in the UK, because all of our pensions are undoubtedly helping to fund deforestation. And actually, while UK companies, food companies, for instance, are doing quite well and pushing the government to do more on deforestation, financial institutions are behind. They're doing a lot less well in recognizing this issue and doing something about it. So we need to focus on the finances, the UK as well.
Okay, thanks for that. Joe, I would like to ask you, what can the UK government and companies do to contribute to reducing deforestation and protecting the rights of Indigenous people? I'm also interested in what you think about this law that the UK government has been consulting on to prevent illegal deforestation in the supply chain of UK businesses. They've finished consulting on it now, and 99% of the 63,000 people who commented were in favour of a law. Is this going in the right direction, and what else can government and companies do?
Sure, thanks, Dom. So yeah, I mean, I think as Nikki and Fiona rightly outlined, the UK government does have a crucial role to play here. Indeed, you don't have to look far to find reports of goods associated with deforestation ending up in UK supermarkets or companies being backed by UK-based financial institutions. And as Nikki also pointed out, you know, for too long we've seen a failure of voluntary initiatives and company policies that are policed only by the companies themselves. Global Canopy has really effectively documented the failings of these company policies, as well as the supply chains that link UK companies to deforestation hotspots as well. So I do agree it's time for UK government to take action. You know, as Nikki rightfully said as well, UK's financial sector has a crucial role to play. In our report, Money to Burn, we looked at the financing of 6 agribusiness companies involved in or closely linked to deforestation. And the UK was in fact the single largest source of international credit and investment over the period we looked at, and had provided $5 billion in financing. This included major banks like HSBC, Barclays and Standard Chartered. So, you know, for sure it's time for UK government to take action. We think that action should be in the form of legislation to stop companies using goods tainted with deforestation. And yes, Dom, as you rightly point out, there are some promising developments on this front in the UK at the moment. So the government's just brought forward legislation in the form of an amendment to the Environment Bill that would ban companies over a certain size from using certain goods associated with illegal deforestation. So companies would be required to undertake checks, due diligence on their supply chains to identify and mitigate the deforestation risk. And as well as reporting on that, they'd also have to report on the due diligence they'd undertaken, and failure to comply could result in sanctions or penalties. I think what I'd say is the devil's in the detail on this, and there are still some areas where we're pushing for improvements, which I'm happy to talk through, Dom, if we have time. I think overall it is a significant development, and it does set a crucial global precedent for other countries to tackle their global deforestation footprint. You know, as Nikki said, in the scale of things, UK is a relatively small market, but we think if this leads others to follow suit, and if the UK sets a high standard in its own legislation, then, you know, this could, you know, hopefully deliver some real global change. Dom, do you have time for me to give a bit more detail on some of the areas we think need strengthening?
Not a great deal of time. I would like just to touch on one area, and this came from someone I was talking to the other day. How easy is it to trace everything that's in your supply chain? For instance, if you have soya that has come from a deforested area that's then been used to feed a pig in Brazil, that meat has then been sold to the UK. How feasible is it that you can actually trace everything that's in the supply chain?
Sure. I mean, I think personally companies have that responsibility to know and understand their full supply chain. It's surely irresponsible of a company to source where it doesn't know that, you know. And I think for too long we've heard companies hide behind this idea they can't get the data. I mean, I think what Global Canopy have shown with their research is you can get the data. And frankly, if you're unable to trace it right back to source, you shouldn't be importing it. And, you know, I think that's something it'd be really important that the legislation is strong on. We understand that's one of the intentions behind it, is to put some of this supply chain data into the public domain. I think that's more likely to come through secondary legislation. but would be really important that that's spelt out in detail. And just while I have the mic, I did want to link this law back to the really crucial point of Indigenous people, as we've heard raised quite often on the panel today. And that's one area in particular we think certainly could be strengthened. And we think it's really crucial, not for the law as it currently does to rely on local laws alone, but for the requirements on companies to go beyond those, and for that to be linked to the principle that Fiona talked about earlier on free, prior and informed consent, and that there should be an obligation through this law on companies to check that there has been free, prior and informed consent within their supply chains. And I think that is a positive thing about the law as it currently stands, is it is on the entire supply chain, not just the moment it was placed under the market. And I think that's also linked to the flaw in the bill at the moment, which is that it only talks about illegal deforestation, which, as we know, is only around half of total tropical deforestation. And where you see countries like Brazil rolling back their forest protection and attempt to weaken their laws, if those are the laws we're relying on to stop our companies being complicit in global deforestation, it's not good enough. It needs to go further. And, you know, we sense that there's definitely an understanding from some parts of government in the scale of this challenge. And we're just calling on them really to up their ambition on those levels, and also to ensure that it covers the finance sectors too, which currently it doesn't.
Okay, that's a very good point. And I think worth mentioning, as you know, myself and colleagues from Repórter Brasil and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and The Guardian have been able to expose in a sequence of reports Brazilian meat companies, including some of the biggest companies in the world, the biggest meat company in the world, JBS, they are still unable to guarantee that they are not sourcing cattle from land or farms that are deforested illegally, despite promising to do it by 2011. They're now promising to do it by 2025. They're still unable to do that, which is kind of staggering if you think of the level of technology that we have today, that you still don't know, basically. We are almost out of time, and I want to ask a question to everybody. You have ideally a minute each. I know that's difficult. And I'd like each one of you to answer, if you can, what can consumers, customers and citizens in the UK do to engage in the fight against Amazon deforestation? What examples have you seen of this working? What advice would you give to them? I'd like to start with Tika, please.
I think that one thing is that was also raised a lot here is the stand in solidarity with the fight of the rights of the indigenous people in Brazil and elsewhere in the world. They are protecting the forest, they are protecting our future from dangerous climate crisis. The other is exert pressure over your governments, as Fiona and Nikki was saying, to have your own national legislations that actually end deforestation in the market side. That also sends a clear message to the governments on the country, the producer countries, whatever commodity it is, mining, timber, cattle, soya, meat, and also on a personal level, actually, if you can reduce your consumption of meat, that you don't have to go vegan. It is a very personal choice, I know, but actually this would take pressure over the forest, because it is the industrial global trade system that actually is also doing this pressure. You might think, one might think that it is only individual and it's not gonna change. But if we act together, actually it can have a very, it can make a difference.
Okay, so eat less meat, very good point. Fiona.
Yes, I think, I think consumers, anybody, I think get onto your MP. MPs are there, you know, to raise your concerns with government. Ask the UK for all the points that have been made already, putting human rights and particularly Indigenous rights central to all the UK government's policies and actions regarding tackling climate change, deforestation. Survival has an action page called Stop Brazil's Genocide on our website with ideas for lobbying your supermarkets to put pressure on them to take proper measures to ensure that produce they're selling is not coming from at the expense of deforestation and indigenous peoples' territories. I think the final point is as Tika said, is support the indigenous peoples. There are so many of them in the forest who do not have the opportunity to speak out like us. You can hear many of their voices on our website, on their own websites. There are lots of indigenous organizations in the Amazon. Participate in their campaigns and our campaigns. Get your MP to say that the UK government, the funding agencies, and you yourself, if you have money, they desperately need money in this fight that, against the frontline defenders, as they call themselves. They need equipment, they need technology to do what is so sorely lacking from the federal agencies for all the reasons we've been discussing. So the support can be financial, it can be moral, it can be advocacy, it can be lobbying. There are so many ways you can support to stand up in solidarity with them, and any will be appreciated. And you can get a list of indigenous organizations from Survival's website. Okay, great. Nikki?
Thanks, Tom. So definitely do the personal and definitely eat less meat. And if you're going to eat meat, eat locally produced grass-fed meat. But more important is target, or equally important, target the system. Pressure on the government's already been mentioned a few times, but finance, that's the other big part of the system that we need to target. Go to the top of the system, the financial system, and call your pension provider if you've got a pension, call your bank if you've got a bank account, and ask them to assure you that your money is not funding deforestation. It's a simple question, but it's an awkward one and a difficult one. And if they don't answer, ask for the manager and ask for the manager's manager, and keep going. And you want an example of this working? A colleague did this and got up to the top of the company just by escalating and escalating and escalating. It's your money, so make sure it's not driving deforestation. It's a really simple thing we can all do. And just quickly on free, prior and informed consent, UK companies need to be doing more on this. The policies, even though there are good policies on deforestation relatively, there are very weak policies that companies have on free, prior and informed consent. So if you want to go one step further, ask your financial institution about their policies and also their policies regarding people's rights, indigenous rights. And without pressure, nothing can happen. So I just also want to thank Gustavo for the pressure his film applies, and to everyone here doing such great work.
Okay, it's a very good point. And I think from the point of someone who's here in Brazil, pressure that Brazil will respond to is financial pressure. It's about money, it's about business. And that's the only thing that this government is going to take any notice of. Stefan, you've just been mentioned. What do you think people in the UK should do?
Well, it's hard for me to, from very far away, to say anything about this, but I love the things that has been told here, financial and consumers and all that. And I could add that I think that know the Amazon, know the forest, travel to Amazon, pass some time inside the forest, and you're gonna feel the energy and the importance of this place is a good thing. And another is, if you can buy things, handcrafts from indigenous people, traditional communities from Brazil, from Amazon, and make this fashion things, because we have a very, very exuberant and beautiful aesthetics, materials and corporal paintings and handcrafts. And I think that this is also something that could help us, all other than all the things that has been told here in this panel.
Okay, and there's definitely a theme which has emerged from all of you, which is the importance of indigenous people in all of it, in protecting the forests and in supporting them so they can protect the forests, because they are in many ways the best guardians. Joe, to conclude, what can people in the UK do?
Sure, in 1 minute. Yeah, as Fiona said, write to your MP. The Environment Bill is currently going through Parliament. The deforestation law is in the form of amendment to that bill. Write to your MP, asking them to support stronger measures to tackle deforestation. There is an EU consultation currently open as well, because the EU is considering similar laws, and I've shared the link in the chat to our website where you can click and submit your views and make the case for stronger laws as well. I'd also encourage civil society groups to consider making their own submissions to the EU consultation as well. Your voices are really important, and do get in touch with us if you would like more advice on how to become directly involved. But we know public support is crucial, and if the governments feel pressure, they are more likely to do something. Thanks.
Okay, and although the UK is no longer part of the EU, the European Union, the EU is due to ratify its trade deal with the Mercosur South American trade bloc. It's very important for the Brazilian government that this happens, and there is a lot of pressure on it for it not to happen. There are a lot of concerns amongst environmentalists in Europe about the environmental guarantees in the bill. So that's something else if you're watching and you're from Europe and you're not from the UK. We're out of time. I would like to give a special thanks to the London Climate Action Week organisers, to Global Witness, Global Canopy and Survival International for helping spread news of the event. A big thank you to Athena McCullum, who's been dealing with the technical aspects of this webinar. A really big thank you to Fiona, Stefan, Nikki, Tika and Joe for being here. Thank you very much. It's been very interesting, and I really appreciate your time. And thanks to everybody who's watched as well. Thank you. Muito obrigado.
I want to add something, Dom. Just a minute. If somebody that is attending our webinar and didn't saw the film and then the link is not working anymore, or want to make an exhibition of the film, I will put the link of my company, Pindorama Films. You can get into the website and get in contact with us and ask for that I can, because we still don't have a distributor in England. So we are dealing with that. But until then, if you want to make an exhibition to your partners, just get in contact with us.
Okay, and I think we'd all agree that it's a very good idea, if you haven't seen the film, to watch it, because it does bring a lot of these issues to life, especially the land grabbing, the tribes, all of this. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for watching, and have a good day.